welcome back everyone. Chapter 10, remember at the end of chapter 9 there, he was at his friend Susan Buttercup's party and everything was going very well. He was being included in social events again and he was feeling good about himself until he had to do the apple game where he had to bite on an apple. Susan's face was in the same bucket. The whole thing turned to chocolate and basically he went home and it was a bad ending. So we only have 2 chapters left here and let's hope for some good news. Okay, I think it's going to turn around. Okay, chapter 10. Dragging along and thinking of all the dreadful things that had happened, John had walked about halfway home when he heard the cheery voice of his father. I'll go down a little lower. There we go. "Hello, hello," called Mr. Midas, crossing over from the other side of the street. He was on his way home from the station. "You left the party rather early, didn't you?" "What?" Mr. Midas had just seen the patches of streaks of chocolate that were drying on John's face and on his clothes. "Good gracious," he said, no wonder why you left the party early. How did that happen?" John burst into tears. It had been such an awful day, but now he could only tell his father about his terrible day. He stopped crying and only sniffled a little now and then as he told the whole story about taking the coin to the candy store, about buying the box that had turned out to have only 1 chocolate in it, about the toothpaste, about breakfast, the gloves, the silver dollar, the pencil, the lunch, the trumpet, and finally, the apple ducking water. "You mean to tell me they really all turned to chocolate?" Mr. Midas asked. You're sure you didn't imagine some of this?" "Oh, no," John assured him. "Well," Mr. Midas said, still looking doubtful, "we're only a couple of blocks from that candy store of yours. Not that I've ever noticed one there. Suppose we stroll over and ask the man whether his chocolates always do strange things to people." "It's on the next counter," John said, recognizing some of the houses on the side street. Not the next house, not the next house, not the next," he said, but John's voice faded into silence. The corner where he had found the candy store was nothing now but an empty lot. Flat, open ground littered with a pile of rusty tin cans and broken bottles around a splintery old sign saying "For Sale." Said Mr. Midas, frowning anxiously at John. "I think we'd better pay a visit to Dr. Cranium before we go home." "That's where the store was, though," John protested, beginning to cry again. He had shed more tears in that one day, it seemed, and certainly eaten more chocolate than all other days of his life put together. "I know it was." Dr. Cranium was a busy man. As luck would have it, though, he was able to see Mr. Midas and John almost at once. "Well, well, well, well," said Dr. Cranium. "And now are we getting along now, John? Have we cut down on our candy?" "How do you do?" John responded dully. "Apparently he's had a bad day, Dr. Cranium," Mr. Midas said. "Trouble at school, you know, and a little accident at the birthday party. What I'm worried about is that he keeps saying that everything he puts into his mouth turns to chocolate." "No more than a nursery fantasy, I'm sure," Dr. Cranium said to Mr. Midas. "Well, John," he went on, looking down with a smile, "suppose you tell me in your own words what the matter seems to be." "Everything I put into my mouth turns to chocolate," John explained. "Everything I eat and everything I drink changes into chocolate. I'm thirsty and I'm getting a pain, a bad one, I think." Dr. Cranium sighed patiently and invited John to open his mouth and say, "Ah." "Ah," John said. Dr. Cranium peered into John's mouth briefly and gave a low whistle of surprise. This chocolate eating simply must stop. He went to his supply cabinet. "I don't think there's any time to be lost," he told Mr. Midas. "I'm going to give the boy some of my own special compound. Dr. Cranium's Exvalar, I call it. It never fails." Dr. Cranium selected a large bottle from one of the cabinet's crowded shelves. He removed the top from the bottle. He got a spoon from another shelf. He filled the spoon with an oily, greenish yellow medicine that had yellowish reddish lights glinting in it. It doesn't taste very pleasant, Dr. Cranium warned John in a pleasant tone of voice, but I'm sure it'll do the trick. Clear the stomach and you clear the mind. That's what I always say. Dr. Cranium offered John a brimful spoon. What do you think? Do you think it's going to turn into chocolate? The stuff that the doctor's going to give? I don't know. Must I? John asked his father. I know it'll turn into chocolate. Go on, Mr. Midas nodded encouragingly. Drink it down. John took the spoon between his lips. The medicine turned to chocolate. The spoon turned to chocolate. John choked and spluttered out. The chocolate syrup spurted from his mouth. Dr. Cranium dropped the spoon in alarm. When it struck the white-tiled floor, the chocolate handle snapped into several pieces. "Oh," said Dr. Cranium. "I've never seen anything like it. The boy's whole system seems to be so chocolified that it chocolifies everything it touches." After he had recovered somewhat, the doctor went on. "I believe that this must be an unprecedented case of, chocolitis. I shall call it Cranium's disease. I shall want to make an exhaustive study of the child. And then Mr. Midas says, and he interrupted the doctor, and he said, "I think John has had enough excitement for one day," Mr. Midas said. That's the end of chapter 10. So it's still, nothing has turned around for poor John Midas, and we're still in a bit of a negative situation. Oh, and guess what? Guess what I just noticed? There's a chapter 12. So I have 2 more chapters to go. Okay. I thought it was one big chapter, but it's 2 small chapters. So we're good to go. Okay, chapter 11. Mrs. Midas was much upset when Mr. Midas told her that John had Dr. Cranium's disease. He said it was chocolitis, Mr. Midas explained, a worried frown on his face. But he's calling it Cranium's disease because it was his discovery. Dr. Cranium didn't do it, John said. It's magic. It all started after I ate that chocolate. I'm scared, he added. Mrs. Midas sat down and dabbed her eyes with the lace handkerchief. She was crying. Mr. Midas blew his nose and said he had to attend to something, and abruptly left the room. John had been so busy feeling sorry for himself that he had not realized how his mother and father would feel about his chocolate disease. You never mind, Mother, he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. It's all right. Really, nothing was all right, but he couldn't bear to see his mother's tears. He kissed her wet cheek. His eyes were shut as his lips softly touched her, so he didn't see the change right away. Then his lips began to feel sticky. He opened his eyes. His mother had turned into a lifeless statue of chocolate. John ran wildly out of the house without thinking where he was going or what he was going to do. All he knew was that somehow he must get help. For the first time in a long time, while he forgot about himself altogether. Now he didn't care about anything but bringing his mother back to life. Without quite knowing how to get there, he got there. John found himself at the corner where he had bought the chocolate box. The lot was no longer untidy rubbish dump. The neat red brick building with 2 show windows was exactly where it had been the first place. But the display of candy he had previously seen in the window was no longer there. In one window, John saw a chocolate trumpet, a chocolate pencil, a silver dollar with a piece bitten out of it. In the other window, he saw a cafeteria tray littered with chocolate utensils and the remains of a chocolate lunch. Clearly, his place was the right one. This place was the right one, sorry. Clearly, the person must know a lot about John's hateful chocolate touch. John rushed into the store. The owner was standing behind the counter, carefully polishing something small and round and flat and silver. I was just thinking of you," he said. John had no time to waste on the pleasantries. "Remember the old coin I found and gave you, and you gave me a magic chocolate?" he demanded. Without waiting for a reply, he babbled on. "I ate it and ate it, and it made everything that touches my mouth turn into chocolate. And I kissed my mother, and now she's chocolate, and I've got to change her back." "Easy now," murmured the storekeeper. "Calm yourself down. Calm down." There was an expression of satisfaction in the old man's eyes. "It's all your fault," John declared. "If my mother isn't made better again, I'm gonna be really mad at you." "My goodness," the storekeeper explained. "Whose fault did you say?" "Yours," John said. "If you hadn't taken that money, I wouldn't have—" "Now, John," the storekeeper interrupted, "I must insist on honesty. I'm glad to hear that you're thinking about your mother for a change. Unselfishness is important, but honesty is also important. If you'll be truthful, perhaps I can help you." John's ears reddened. It was becoming unmistakably evident to him that he had only himself to blame for all this unhappiness. He looked straight into the storekeeper's eyes. "I'll do anything. I'll work for you all my life for nothing. If you turn my mother back, you can turn me to chocolate instead. If you want, you can—" And then the storekeeper apparently ignored John's offers. "You were right, John," he said, "when you guessed that I had something to do with your acquiring the chocolate touch. But you yourself earned that coin, the coin that brought the chocolate touch. Only greedy people can even see that kind of money. Dr. Granium was right, up to a point. I suppose that one could say that you had chocolitis, but it was just an outward sign of selfishness." "My mother," John reminded the storekeeper frantically. "My mother's turned into chocolate. Do something about it. Oh, please, 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 do something about it." "I'm glad you are concerned," the storekeeper commented unhurriedly. "Part of the cure is to be concerned about other people. You have been so greedy that you didn't care what happened to other people." "Oh, I know," John admitted woefully. "But please decide about me later and make my mother better now." "Well, John," the storekeeper said, "if you had to choose between getting rid of your chocolate touch and restoring your mother to life, which would it be?" For one moment, John couldn't help imagining a future of all chocolate meals. The thought was terrible. But then he thought of his mother as she had been when he had left her, a motionless chocolate statue, unable to speak, her chocolate hand still holding her lace handkerchief. Without further hesitation, John said, "Help my mother." "Well, John," the storekeeper said, "I'm going to give you another chance. When next you go to school, your chocolate pencil will be a real wooden pencil with lead in it." "But," John began to protest, "what did the pencil matter? The chocolate knife and fork and spoon you left on your tray in the cafeteria will have turned back to metal. Your chocolate trumpet will be shiny golden once again." "But," John said, "don't worry about Mr. Cranium's spoon. He will find a whole silver one on the floor, where the broken chocolate one lay." "But how about," John said, "Susan and then the doctor says Susan Buttercup will discover that the chocolate stains on her party dress and her shoes were nothing but water after all. Her silver dollar will be all right too." John could stand the suspense no longer. "My mother," he shouted. "What about my mother? Will she be all right?" The storekeeper smiled. "Why don't you run along home and find out?" he suggested. John turned without even saying goodbye and ran out of the store. The storekeeper went back to the disc that he had been polishing, a disc the size of a quarter. It had to be polished smooth, ready for a new set of initials, in case the need for them should arise. Interesting. Now that was a good ending of a chapter. I believe there was like a magic spell or something, and we'll see what happens. Last chapter of the book right now. Chapter 12. The front door was open and John rushed into the living room where he had left his mother. She was not there now, but on the chair was a small wet lace handkerchief. John ran into the dining room and onto the kitchen. As he came to the kitchen door, he heard the ring of silver against crockery. Then he saw a wonderful sight, his mother arranging the coffee things on a tray. He dashed into the kitchen and flung his arms around his mother's waist, sobbing and laughing with relief and joy. There, there, said Mrs. Midas, stroking the hair from John's forehead. You've had a very disturbing day, dear, but in a few minutes we're all going to have supper and everything will be fine again. Goodness, I do believe I need some coffee myself. I felt so strange just then in the other room. I really don't know what came over me. The door from the garden opened and Mr. Midas came in. Before we settle down, Mrs. Midas said to John, have a glass of good cold milk. You look so hot. So they didn't know what had happened to her. Well, John thought, he certainly wouldn't scare them by telling them. He watched gratefully as his mother took a frosty blue jug from the refrigerator and poured from it a glassful of icy creamy milk. Trembling with nervousness, John tilted the glass against his mouth. The liquid flowed in and down his throat and remained purely milky, deliciously milky, tasting of nothing but fresh, clean milk. After the first long, wonderful gulps, he suddenly recalled that he had not thanked the storekeeper for saving his mother. Mother, he said, may I go out for a minute? I'll be right back. All right, John, she said, but supper will be ready in 10 minutes. Don't keep us waiting. John ran briskly down the street until he came to the corner where he always turned right when he was going to Susan's house. There he turned left instead and started along the 2 blocks of unfamiliar street leading to the candy store. Soon he came to the corner where the red brick building had been. But there was no building and no store, of course, no storekeeper. In the corner lot, there was nothing to be seen but a heap of rusty tin cans and broken bottles surrounding a signboard with a new lettering that said, sold. Isn't that neat? Okay, so the end. So in the end, The Chocolate Touch, we would call this book a fiction story. So it's not real, right? So it was a story about a boy who was very, very picky in eating, and all he wanted was sweets and chocolate all day long. But then once he realized that if that's the only thing he could eat and what was available, it would be a very scary thing. It would be very, very boring. So in the end, I believe he's able to eat all of the vegetables and fruit and proteins that his parents want him to. So that's great. Now I wanted to show you something that I think would be something that's easily done at home if you want. This is optional. See this? I'll put it nice and close. It's called a Rainbow Crunch, and it's a bit of a paper craft that Mrs. Young, my teaching partner, did a few years ago when she read this story. And what it was after she read the books to them, the students could develop and create their own name of chocolate and a chocolate bar and think of something fun and put an ingredient list on the back. And then that was their craft or art for the week. But what I'm proposing to everyone to do, if you want, is in the next few days, draw a picture of a new kind of chocolate bar, a brand new name that does not exist, and put the ingredient list and just make sure I can read it and email it to me or scan it or just try to take a picture of it with your parents' phone and email it to me, and I would love to see all of your new ideas. And I don't know if you see online, but every Friday there's a section on the daily special events called Jokes with Mrs. DeLong, and whoever sends me their idea of the best chocolate bar in the world, every single person who sends it, I will I will talk about it and show it to the camera on Jokes with Mrs. DeLong. It's going to be all fun stuff on that show. Okay? So if you're interested in sending me, please send me a picture and scan it and email it to me. And let's hear all of the new chocolate bar names. Okay? Take care, everyone. Thank you for listening. And let's go get moving a little bit. I've been sitting around for a while now. I got to get moving. Okay, bye.